The most prestigious museum in the city was selling original artworks and replacing them with replicas. When I reported it, they threatened to destroy my career. But they didn't know I had chemical analyses of every work and direct contacts at Interpol Art. There are lies built with beauty, not carelessly or in haste, with the patience of someone who knows their craft, who knows exactly which details to look at and which to ignore, who has calculated that most people who enter a museum are there to admire rather than to verify. And admiration, when it is genuine, does not question. That is the vulnerability that someone in that museum had been exploiting for years. I found it because my job is not to admire. My job is to look with professional suspicion at every centimeter of a painted surface and ask myself what it is telling me and what it is hiding from me. And what I found when I started looking that way was a lie so well constructed that it was almost an art form in itself. Almost. My name is Isabel. I am 41 years old. I am an art restorer specializing in European painting from the 17th to the 19th centuries and in technical analysis of pictorial materials. I have spent 16 years in this specialty, which is one of the smallest and most closed in the art world. Few of us practice it at the level that the most important institutions require, and that scarcity gives us a visibility and a responsibility that does not exist in more popular disciplines. My work requires a combination of art history, chemistry, optics, and a kind of intuition built on thousands of hours of direct contact with original works that teaches you to recognize the authentic in a way that is difficult to articulate, but that is as real as any laboratory analysis. That intuition was what first warned me. The laboratory analysis was what confirmed it. The Calderon Museum is the most important cultural institution in the city. Founded 120 years ago, it has a permanent collection of approximately 800 works, including 17th-century Flemish paintings, French Impressionists, Latin American modernists, and a contemporary art section that has developed over the last 2 decades. It is the kind of museum that children visit on school trips and that tourists include in their itineraries and that citizens consider part of the city's identity with the diffuse pride of someone who owns something valuable even if they don't know exactly what makes it valuable. I worked there for 4 years as the principal restorer. 4 years of privileged access to the collection. For years of knowing each work the way you know a person, its history, its peculiarities, the marks of time that make it unique and irreplaceable. That was exactly what allowed me to notice when something had changed. The first sign came with a Vermeer. Not one of the great ones, not one of the painter's most famous works, but a minor domestic interior that had been part of the collection since the museum's founding and that I had restored 2 years earlier in a process that had lasted 3 months and that I knew with the intimacy of someone who has spent weeks looking at every millimeter of surface. I came across it in one of my routine reviews, and something did not add up. It was not visible to the naked eye. It was not the kind of difference that a casual visitor would notice, or even an art connoisseur who was not a specialist in pictorial technique. It was a difference in the way the paint responded to light at certain angles, in the texture of the ground layer beneath the paint layers, in something that can only be described as the feeling of looking at a surface that was behaving slightly differently from how the one I had restored had behaved. I requested authorization from the Conservation Department to conduct a complementary technical analysis under the pretext of a post-restoration follow-up review, which is a standard procedure that no one questioned. I took microscopic samples from 3 strategic points. I took them to the laboratory. The results took 2 weeks. What the laboratory returned was a report I read 3 times before it stopped seeming like an error. The pigments in the upper paint layer of the analyzed samples corresponded to synthetic pigments developed in the 20th century. The Vermeer had been painted in the 17th century. 20th century synthetic pigments cannot be in a 17th century painting unless someone had put them there. What I was looking at was not the Vermeer I had restored 2 years earlier. It was a replica, an extraordinarily well-executed replica, with a level of technical skill that in itself represented years of specialized work, but a replica, not the original. I did not move during the following days, not in the external sense. I kept going to the museum. I kept doing my work. I kept interacting with my colleagues with the normalness one maintains when you know something you don't yet know how to use. But internally, I started doing what I do when I have a technical problem to solve, building the complete picture before making any decision. I systematically reviewed the works in the collection that I had restored or had direct technical contact with during my 4 years at the museum. Not all 800 works, but the 47 I had sufficient technical familiarity with to be able to detect differences with certainty. Of the 47, I found irregularities in 9. 9 works with characteristics that did not correspond with what I remembered of them or with what the documentation of their previous restorations described. I requested complementary analyses for 6 of the 9 using different professional pretexts that would not generate suspicion. 4 of the 6 analyses confirmed the presence of anachronistic materials for more works that were not what the museum said they were. I built the file over 3 months, with the laboratory reports, with high-resolution photographs under different lighting conditions showing the technical differences, with the documented restoration history that established how the works should appear at specific points and how they appeared now, with records of the moments when each work had been temporarily out of exhibition under different pretexts, which was presumably when the replacement had occurred, and with something I found when I started searching in the museum's temporary loan records. Several of the originals I believed had been replaced had left the museum on temporary loans to private collections in the months or years prior to when I noticed the irregularities. Loans that in the museum's internal registration system appeared as returned, but that based on the technical analyses had clearly not been returned. They had been replaced by replicas, and the originals had remained in private collections. The museum was not lending works. It was selling them, and it was using the temporary loan mechanism as cover for the movement of works out of the institution. I went to the museum director on a Wednesday morning. The director's name is Mauricio Andrade. He is 58 years old, has been at the head of the institution for 12 years, and has the kind of institutional presence that is built when a person has occupied the same position long enough that the position and the person seem like the same thing. I presented a selection of the documentation to him. 3 works with their complete analyses. The pattern of temporary loans with the dates and destinations. The technical differences documented between the current state and the state prior to the departures. He listened to me with an expression that changed progressively during the 20 minutes it took me to present everything. When I finished, he told me that what I was describing was an extraordinarily serious accusation that required careful internal investigation before it could be seriously considered. That in the meantime, it was fundamental that I maintain absolute confidentiality to avoid damaging the institution's reputation with information that might be incorrect. That he would personally ensure the matter was reviewed with the museum's technical and legal team. He asked me to leave the documents I had brought. I told him they were copies, that the originals were elsewhere. His expression changed again. The call came 2 days later. It was from a museum's attorney. He told me that after a preliminary review, the institution's technical team had not been able to confirm the irregularities I described, that the differences I had observed had legitimate technical explanations related to conservation conditions and prior restoration processes, that the museum considered my conclusions to be the result of incomplete analysis or incorrect technical interpretation, and that if I proceeded to disseminate these claims publicly or to third parties, the museum would consider legal action for institutional damage and reputational damage, and would additionally communicate to the ethics committees of the Professional Restorer Association's information about what he described as irresponsible professional conduct on my part. It was a threat in every sense of the word, well formulated, in legal language, with specific consequences named. I told the attorney I heard his position, that I would be in contact with him in the coming days. I hung up, and I opened my computer to draft the email that had been prepared for weeks for exactly this moment. The email went to 4 recipients. The first was the Cultural Crimes Unit of Interpol, known informally as Interpol Art, with whom I had had professional contact 3 years earlier at a conference on illicit trafficking of cultural goods. I sent them the complete documentation with a letter explaining the case and requesting that they evaluate whether what I had found corresponded with art trafficking patterns they were monitoring. The second was the Cultural Heritage Department of the relevant ministry, which has jurisdiction over museums with public funding, like the Calderon Museum, and has the mandate to order independent audits of collections. The third was an academic specializing in artwork authentication at the most important university in the country, with whom I had collaborated on research projects and whose scientific credibility was irreproachable, attaching the laboratory reports and requesting her independent review. The fourth was a journalist specializing in culture and institutions who had spent years covering the art world with the rigor that topics involving public patrimony require. To all four, I said the same thing I had said to contacts in other situations. If in the following days they had not heard from me with an update, they could assume something had prevented me from proceeding, and they had my authorization to act with the information according to their own judgment. Interpol Art responded within 48 hours. What they told me in that response I cannot reproduce in detail for reasons of confidentiality of the process that was opened. But I can say that the information I had sent coincided with patterns they were already monitoring independently, and that my documentation was the kind of internal evidence they had not had until that point. The Cultural Heritage Ministry ordered an emergency audit of the museum's collection 3 days after receiving my communication. The academic issued an independent technical opinion confirming my conclusions on the analyzed works and adding historical and technical context that strengthened the case. And the journalist published a first story 5 days after receiving my email, describing the existence of an ongoing investigation without revealing all the details, enough for the case to be in the public domain before the museum could attempt to suppress it. The emergency audit lasted 6 weeks. The independent auditors, who included restorers from other national and international museums convened by the ministry, examined the complete collection with the technical analysis protocols I had applied to the specific works I had identified. What they found exceeded what I had documented. Of the 800 works in the permanent collection, 22 had been replaced by replicas at some point over the previous 12 years. 22 originals that, at that moment, through the work of Interpol Art with their counterparts in other countries, were being tracked in private collections in 4 different countries. The sales network was broader than my 4 years at the museum had allowed me to see. Mauricio Andrade was placed in preventive detention during the investigation. 2 members of the museum's board of directors were also charged. An art dealer with operations in several countries was identified as the principal intermediary for the sales. The threats from the museum's attorney never materialized, not because they had decided not to execute them, but because when the ministerial audit and the Interpol Art investigation were underway, the museum's legal team had significantly more urgent problems than pursuing the restorer who had reported the irregularities. The professional restorer associations, far from sanctioning my conduct, issued statements recognizing that I had acted in accordance with the profession's ethical standards. I lost my job at the museum. It was inevitable and was the outcome I had accepted as the price of proceeding. I found work at another institution 6 months later, an institution that when it learned my story hired me precisely because it wanted someone who had demonstrated they knew how to act correctly when things were difficult. That was unexpected, and it was the closest thing to reparation the process gave me directly. The recovered works are being processed by Interpol Art and the Ministry for restitution to the museum. The process is long because it involves jurisdictions of 4 countries and private collectors, some of whom acquired the works in good faith without knowing they were stolen. The law in these cases is complex and the timelines are long. But the works exist. They're being tracked. Some have already been recovered. And the museum that lost them now has an independent audit system for a collection that did not exist before, implemented by the ministry as a condition for the continuity of its operation with public funds. That system exists because someone decided to look with professional suspicion when everything else invited admiration. Professional suspicion, when well applied, is not cynicism. It is the most honest form of respect that can be shown to art. If this story left you breathless, comment. Did you know this can happen in real museums? Like if you believe cultural heritage deserves real protection. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who loves art and needs to know there are people who protect it. Practical tip. If you visit museums and have technical knowledge in art, trust your intuition when something doesn't add up. There are mechanisms to report suspicions about the authenticity of works in public collections to cultural heritage bodies and to Interpol Art. Cultural heritage belongs to everyone, and everyone has a responsibility to protect it.